Hey everybody, in this video I wanted to do something a little different. I want to take a bit of a detour from the Stephen King content and take a few minutes to highlight one of my favorite limiteds of all time, and it is this edition of Strange Weather by Stephen King's son, Joe Hill. This was published by Cemetery Dance. So if you're like me, huge Stephen King fan, Stephen King collector, Stephen King constant reader, and you also make space at the right hand of the father for the works of Joe Hill, who in my opinion is sort of the heir apparent to the literary legacy of Stephen King. And initially, when I started following him and read his first couple of collections and novels, to me it felt like Joe Hill was my generation's Stephen King. That is to say, people who grew up with reading Stephen King in the 70s and 80s and started collecting him back in those days, back when you could actually send him a book or multiple books. I don't know how that worked. And he would sign them and send them back to you. And now, decades later, those books are worth hundreds of dollars. What an amazing thing. But he has since, collecting Stephen King has become a pricier and more exclusive proposition. And to me, I always felt like I was getting in on the ground floor of my generation's Stephen King in Joe Hill. I have since, it helps to illustrate, I think, how prolific Stephen King is, that by comparison, Joe Hill, who is not unprolific, he comes out with a new print book. There's a gap of several years. He has many irons in the fire. He does graphic novels, TV shows, movies, all of the above. But like anyone, I would love for there to be more new print Joe Hill content. But that's just not in the cards. He's the creator, he's the artist, and he works at his own pace, and that's perfectly fine. So what we have now, after nearly 20 years of publishing, is a fairly modest, but still very varied and interesting and gripping Joe Hill library of a few collections and a few novels. And what is very amusing to me is that Stephen King publishes books so fast, and some of his newer works have signed limited editions. Many of his older works do, but there's a number of works that have never been represented in a signed limited type of format, and may never be. But comparatively, every single major Joe Hill work, and in fact many minor Joe Hill works, now have received at least one signed limited edition. Many of the titles have received multiple signed limited editions. And in fact, there have been signed limited editions of the entire collection. So Full Throttle is a collection of stories. Full Throttle, the collection, received a signed limited edition from Subterranean Press. And now there are signed limited editions being released of the individual stories. There's novellas receiving signed limited editions. Fawn, the short story, received very recently what seems to be a beautiful signed limited edition, but it's a signed limited edition of a piece of a collection that also already has a signed limited edition. So the market seems to be inexhaustible. I get, like, companies produce works that they believe they can sell, and if it proves that they can sell them, then they are driven to release more works. And in the background, Brian over at Lividian Publications is in the process of producing an entire matching Joe Hill library, and those books are absolutely beautiful, and it'll look really cool when they're all lined up together on a row on the shelf. And the next one coming out from Lividian is Horns, which of course received a high profile, very beautiful signed limited edition release from Suntup Editions several years ago. But I have heard via email update from Brian that the Lividian release of Horns will have dozens of pages of bonus content, which will justify its existence. I don't know. I'm at my peak. If it was a title or an author that I really cared about, I was game to buy every single edition that came along. I have heard people, some long-term collectors complain about this company or that company releasing a new signed limited of a title that we already have a really high class signed limited edition of. I don't see the point. Well, to me, I think from a collector's perspective, I really appreciate when some companies go back and double dip into areas that have already been covered, because, from experience, I can tell you that sometimes these books, if you don't know about them, even if you do, if you're not there at the particular day, at the particular time, and you don't have a particular amount of money in your account to spend, then you miss out. And in the entire world, billions of people and hundreds of millions of readers and fans, some of these books come out in, if it's 1,000 copies, it's considered a big run for a signed limited edition. So only 1,000 people out of potentially billions on planet Earth have access to purchase this particular limited edition. So I don't particularly mind. I came into my collecting journey at a certain point where I hopelessly missed out on many things that were very reasonable and very affordable in the 80s and the 90s when it comes to Stephen King in particular. So rather than go back and spend eye-watering amounts of money on old books, I just resolved that going forward, I would always pay attention and I would always be there. And, the books like Cujo from Stephen King that received a signed limited back in the day, it was decades later, was finally covered again by PS Publishing in the UK, where rather than spend hundreds, if not over $1,000 on the original signed limited release of Cujo, which was just completely not an option for me, I could be there and spend $150 on the edition from PS Publishing. Although it wasn't signed by Stephen King, it's still a limited edition release of a title that I cared very much about. So that is all a lengthy and complete diversion from what I thought the purpose of this video was going to be, which was to talk about Strange Weather, the edition released by Cemetery Dance. Strange Weather, so far as I know, has only been released in a signed limited by Cemetery Dance. This is the one to get. I think there's also a numbered, or I guess this is the numbered. I'm sure there's some kind of fancier trim edition in the works, but so far as I know, this is the only one that has so far been released. As you probably know about Cemetery Dance, it's almost a running joke in the collecting world that if they announce something, you better hope that you're still alive years later when you finally have the thing in hand. This one, the wait from when I initially purchased it to when I had it in hand, I don't even know. It was years. It wasn't a decade, but it also wasn't months. It was years. But once you have it, you have it. And when I got it, I realized, I don't know if it was worth the wait. It's beautiful. I'm glad I have it. I don't know what else I would have done. I just continued to live day to day while this thing was being thought of and produced and finally released and shipped. And then eventually I got it. And it was love at first sight. This is one of the very coolest limited editions that I have ever owned. It's Strange Weather is a novella collection, 4 novellas similar to different seasons. I keep mentioning Stephen King, but to me, Stephen King and Joe Hill are sort of hand in hand in my mind and in my collecting journey. 3 out of the 4 novellas I consider to be absolutely and utterly brilliant. Loaded was probably, Loaded and Rain were probably my favorites. I think Snapshot was also brilliant, classic. Aloft is a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit more bizarre, a little bit more far out. And while I still enjoyed it, I don't remember so much about it. In fact, I think the only thing I remember from it is the main character in the story having sex with a cloud. So if that tells you anything about the story, if I could summarize it in one sentence, I guess it would be the main character has sex with a cloud. If that seems like something that you would be interested in learning more about, then I would definitely recommend checking out Aloft. No judgment from me either way. But what was so exciting to me about this release, I know that it's way more work, it's way more cost to produce a multi-volume set. PS Publishing in the UK had done several multi-volume sets of their Stephen King releases, including Salem's Lot, which is not a particularly massive book. They did The Stand, which I totally get because The Stand is huge. They released it in 3 volumes. Salem's Lot, which is about a third as long as The Stand, they also released in 3 volumes. So what you end up with is this big box with multiple books in it, multiple additional pieces of artwork. Really, really cool effect, and I really like it. But PS Publishing in the last several years has sort of shied away from that. So even like Needful Things, which is a lengthy book, they released in 1 volume. And Different Seasons, which actually is a novella collection, and I was really hoping would have been released as 4 books in 1 case, with each novella standing alone, probably to save on cost and to keep the price low for their customers. They opted to go with a single volume. Still looks fine, still is beautiful, but I think the thing that probably puts Strange Weather over the top for me is it's the 4 volumes, each novella having its own dedicated volume, and I just absolutely love that. Initially, I understand that the idea was for each book, each story, to have a standalone volume, and each would have a standalone wraparound dust jacket by a different artist. And so each volume would be signed by the artist. Well, so one thing you can say about Cemetery Dance, it takes ages to get their books, but in the interim, while they're taking ages to produce a new work, they sometimes go back and add additional special features and just nice things that they hadn't originally planned on. And so what they did with Strange Weather was they included additional interior artwork by each author into each story, which I do not believe was the original plan. So here is Snapshot. Front cover, back cover. There is the signature page for Snapshot. The edition is limited to 948 numbered copies, so I would imagine 1,000 copies total would leave 52 lettered copies coming at some point in the future. Like I said, I've not heard that edition has actually been released and been received by people. That would probably be A through Z and then AA through ZZ to do the 26 letters over again. But anyway, this is number 687, signed by Gabriel Rodriguez and Joe Hill. There's that. And inside, the artwork is rendered in black and white. and that is perfectly okay. It is interesting, and it works in the context, and it is a nice effect to have that additional bonus artwork that wasn't expected. So here is Aloft with a very Lovecraftian Cthulhu kind of cover image. I don't remember anything about whatever this is, which probably says something about, well, either about my memory or about the story itself. Like I said, all I remember is Sex with a Cloud. But this one is, signature page is signed by artist Charles Paul Wilson III. Only the first volume is signed by Joe Hill, which makes sense in the context of the release. There is, I think, something to do with that cloud sex that I was talking about. But anyway, that's Aloft. And then Loaded, there's the front cover artwork of Loaded. Loaded, I think, is the best. It's the one where I was just like on the edge of my seat. And then when it ended, I was just like, God, oh my God, it just blew me away, so to speak. No pun intended for that. But the Loaded is signed by artist Zach Howard. So that is the fourth signature overall amongst the multi-volume set. There's an example of the interior artwork. So they all the interior artwork kind of goes together.
That's because all interior artwork is by Chris Bankston, who didn't sign any volume.
It all kind of makes sense in the context of the overall release, but it also, each one is unique as well. This is the longest volume in the set at 194 pages. And then finally, Rain. Joe Hill. So what I think Joe Hill does really well is coming up with ideas that, Stephen King has talked at length about where he gets ideas, or he'll be walking and he'll walk over a bridge and he'll think of the Three Billy Goats gruff. And then all of a sudden he's like, I have this nucleus. And then years later we have it, or something like The Shining or something like that. But Joe Hill does clever ideas damn well. And the clever idea in Rain is that all of a sudden there's a thunderstorm, and instead of water, the skies rain nails, basically spikes. And then it's just what happens to society after that cataclysmic event. And it's really creative, and it's really interesting, and it's very harrowing, and it's very scary, and it's very gruesome, and it's very all those things that you would hope for and love from Joe Hill. This one is signed by artists Renee Delise and Ray Dillon. So there's that. So that's actually 6 signatures in this 4-volume set, which is really cool. And just a couple of instances of interior artwork, not loaded, so to speak, with it, but it was not promised initially, so anything is kind of welcome as a bonus. One thing that's worth mentioning about this set is that under the jackets, the boards they all look like this, just brown with kind of a coppery gold printing on the spine, on the cover. That's one thing that I have always noticed about Cemetery Dance releases, even on their oversized deluxe Stephen King releases that are 7 by 10 inches and just huge and so heavy you can't imagine actually reading them, because they're almost hard to hold just to enjoy, let alone to hold for hours while you read them. But The dust jacket is really cool. The interior artwork is really cool. Slipcase looks really nice, but then they seem to always go with sort of an understated, sort of simple, plain. It matches the overall theme of the release, but the boards are usually, just a single color. They're attractive. They just, whereas PS Publishing, their boards are printed and may have like wild additional artwork, images. Cemetery Dance chooses to go a bit more reserved and a bit more formal approach to their boards, but that's really neither here nor there, because the books are still lovely. Like I mentioned, and I've mentioned before, and I'm sure I will mention again in future videos, once you have them, you're glad that you bought them, and the weight just kind of disappears. But it can be discouraging because Cemetery Dance, they'll announce something, it's a big deal, there's a huge rush for it, and it's like the publishing world's most extreme example of hurry up and wait. You throw your money at them, dear God, yes, I want this book, please, 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 and then years later, you actually receive it. So I don't know. It's just one of those things. Cemetery Dance releases some amazing books, and they have some deals with some amazing authors. And I mean, that's just part of the deal of doing business with Cemetery Dance. But anyway, Strange Weather is such a cool release, and if you've not seen it, if you've not heard of it, I wanted to show it because I'm a big fan, and I thought you might be as well. If you're not in the market for the signed limited edition, I highly recommend picking up the collection. The 4 stories are each very unique, and like I said, I think 3 of them are masterpieces, and 1 features cloud porn, basically, which is something I had never experienced prior to this book. And if nothing else, it expanded my horizons and sort of gave me an additional glimpse as to what might be possible out there in the entire scope of the human experience. Anyway, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for your support of the channel. I really appreciate it. I hope that you don't mind this little diversion into Joe Hill territory. I do plan at some point to cover his books as well. Although the channel is primarily devoted to Stephen King, I consider them to be sort of part and parcel, and he is definitely the heir apparent to the family throne, and I look forward to whatever he chooses to create and bestow upon us in the future. But until next time, take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you later. Bye.